Hello. I'll kind of start by saying this is purposely kind of a dumb title. Got to put butts in seats, right? So yeah, like you said, I'm Josh. I run user experience for Huge in Europe. Just kind of give you a sense, just kind of everybody runs through the creds. Huge is, a company we've been around for about 15 years now. And when I started, the company was relatively small. And we, got the typical brief was like, hey, make us a website, and that was kind of it. Over time, though, like the company has grown quite a bit, and so has the stuff that we deliver. We're doing all kinds of stuff now, especially in like business consulting, stuff like working with stuff that doesn't have screens, applications, set-top boxes, kiosks, game consoles, all that kind of stuff. What's interesting is like as the company has evolved, more and more disciplines have become necessary. You end up needing data science experts and content strategists and brand planners and all this kind of stuff. And the natural predilection that I've seen kind of in both the evolution of digital and the company that I work for is that there's this natural kind of bias for specialization, compartmentalization, and basically, creating that bucket brigade process of one person handing something to another and gathering a group of experts to work in one room. And I think, like, although there's a lot of value in that, there's also kind of pitfalls to it. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So this is the question that I get all the time. Every time that I come back into the country, I have to fill out a landing card and go through customs. They're like, what do you do for a living? And this is kind of a thing that plagues me because, I've been in the industry. I got into commercial art or graphic design like when I was in like the mid-90s, and I've been doing this job for like 15 years now. And the title I've had has evolved over time as well. Like I was an interactive designer at one point. I was like a Flash designer at one point. And like that job title has changed. I think it's a natural result of the evolution of the industry and of people in general. And so I show this slide because when I was in high school is when I got interested in graphic design and getting interested in what was then called commercial art. I think I was probably the last person ever taught how to do manual paste ups, and camera ready art and all this kind of stuff, which I learned it was interesting, and then I graduated and it was completely useless instantly. The other thing is I grew up in Seattle, and so I was exposed to Microsoft and like the original .com boom really, really early. So while I was studying kind of like art and design in school, I was like playing around with HTML, CSS, and all that kind of stuff, at home. So when I graduated from college, I basically was a graphic designer who knew how to code, which at the time was a pretty valuable skill set. That's the only reason I have a job now, I think. So when people ask me, what do you do? Like, this is what I tell them. I'm like, I'm a designer. But this doesn't work at customs. They want more specificity than that. And then, you start going through this whole thing of like, and I think if I probably surveyed the room, there's probably developers who do a bit of design, designers who do a bit of development, designers who know how to do information architecture, that kind of stuff. But I don't think it's actually the most healthy thing in the world. A while ago, I was introduced to this concept called T-shaped people, and it was, Tim Brown from IDEO, basically, I think is the one who's kind of, popularized this idea. But, it's pretty simple. It's like you have this area of deep understanding, but like other ability to work outside of your core area and have broad familiarity to a lot of things. When I first saw this, I was like, oh, this is brilliant. This is like one of the smartest things I've ever seen. Like a T-shaped person, that's great. And then I realized it was just a bar graph turned upside down. And so like if I look at like my T, it kind of looks more like this. Like for half my career, I was a visual designer. But like I kind of had this realization at some point that I cared more about how things worked than how they looked, and there's a lot of designers who are a lot better than me, and I kind of like shifted over a little bit. But at the same time, I still know how to do user research, and I know how to do front-end development, and I've actually like released production-ready code into live environments and stuff like that. So it's kind of like kind of my point. In my job every day, we use this 80-20 rule. Like 80% of the results come from 20% of the sources. And I think this is really interesting. Like, if it works in technology, like, why doesn't it work for people? And, you know, that 20% barrier to, like, be effective is actually a relatively low kind of, you know, bar to get over. And, like, I don't think that, you know, you want to hire a bunch of people who are only 20% good at any one thing, but I would much rather have a group of people on my team that have a skill set that looks something like this than, like, you know, hiring a typographer who just knows typography and a developer who just knows development. You know, I think you get a lot more from people when they can kind of move from one discipline to another. You can get a lot more done with smaller teams. The thing no one ever says when you ask them what they do for a living is, I'm a generalist, because it's pretty much the most derided and horrible label that you can probably apply to yourself, which I think is kind of unfortunate, actually. I mean, I think the you know, rubrics aside, I think the spirit of it is nice, you know, and I think, like, having more of a general attitude and a general approach to your work and to your development as a person, I think is really useful. This brings me to Josh Payton's oversimplified and probably inaccurate version of history. Because I think if you look back in time, you see that you know, history is actually littered with generalists or with these, like, the idea of, like, a polymath. And so, like, you go back to the Renaissance, right? And, like, you know, cultural movement, blah, blah, blah. But if you look up Renaissance man, like, it is the definition of polymath. It's a person whose expertise spans a significant number of different subject areas. And inevitably, you run into this guy. OG polymath, Leonardo da Vinci, arguably the most diversely talented person, you know, ever to have lived. He painted the Mona Lisa, he designed airplanes, he robbed graves. He was a generalist. Read the list, it's kind of unbelievable. But the interesting thing is that the Renaissance was littered with these guys. Galileo, you know, physicist, mathematician, engineer, astronomer, philosopher. Michelangelo, again, sculptor, painter, architect, poet. And actually, one of my favorite things about Michelangelo is that he was a sculptor for years and years and years, and then he, you know, painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. I think he only painted about 6 things in his entire career, and he was forced into it by the Medici family because they gave him the awesome option: you either become a painter or we're going to kill you. And, you know, necessity is the mother of invention. But this brings me to the Industrial Revolution, right? When you start to see this pattern, you know, continue. You know, there's Ben Franklin, right? He was, you know, he's a systems guy, author, printer, civic activist, statesman. My favorite thing that he invented, you know, tied the key to the kite and flew it in a storm, inventing what I would like to argue is the first stunt kite. Good times. And then, of course, you have Thomas Edison. You know, he has, you know, upwards of 1,200 patents in his name. He's established a bunch of major new industries worldwide. He was also an astounding dickhead. He electrocuted elephants, drove Nikola Tesla insane. You know, but he basically, like, revolutionized, you know, electric light and power utilities. You know, invented sound recording, invented the motion picture industry, invented communications. You know, like, a very kind of broad you know, spectrum of things that he was working on. You know, his company, you could say, but give him credit, whatever. Which brings me to the digital revolution, which, you know, is the thing that I think, you know, I'm most excited about, you know, in life, I guess, because it's something that's happening right now, and we're very fortunate to be witnessing the unfolding of how digital is affecting the entire world right now. I would argue that, you know, the digital revolution started here, at least in terms of, like, consumer electronics or you know, mass media acceptance of that. It's the Xerox PARC Alto, 1973, came out. Everybody knows about the Macintosh, 1984. There's the ad, whatever, Steve Jobs, thumbs up. And then Windows 95. This was, like, I think this was kind of the major inflection point of, you know, computers really kind of entering, you know, the cultural lexicon of the world. It was the most dominant thing ever, like, in 1995. And maybe I'm biased because I lived in Seattle at the time, but you couldn't go anywhere without running into Bill Gates and Microsoft. But then, like, if you look at, like, this is kind of the point when the internet, you know, really kind of, consumer internet really kicked off, and you kind of, like, start to look at what the state of the art was. And this is only 20 years ago, right? Like, this was probably, when I saw this, I thought this was the coolest website I'd ever seen, you know, in 1996. This got all of the most advanced things you could do on a website at the time, you know, transparent GIFs, circular navigation. I had no idea how they do that. Probably the first time I looked at the source code of a site trying to figure out how they did that. Perfectly repeating background. Amazing. Google, kind of looks the same, actually. Amazon, this is what Amazon looked like in 1999. Shitty. And then you see like right around 2000, but that's like Amazon, it was kind of like at the point when commerce started to come in, right? And then around 2000, you started to see companies like HighRes. This is a site they did, I think, 2000, 2001, called Soulbath. And I think this is the time like Flash was really, really popular. It made the web accessible to designers, and you started to see a kind of a more of a design revolution start to happen in the digital space, and things stopped looking so ugly all the time. 2004 is kind of like around the time that you started the inflection of Web 2.0 and social media kicking off, the Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, another amazing dickhead. 2005, the hottest cell phone on the market, and the selling point was just that it was thin. I have like probably 5 or 6 of these in a drawer somewhere at my house still. Go back and try to use one. They're god-awful. And then, 2007, of course, the launch of the iPhone. I think this was kind of the point when, the big push of smartphones like really kind of entered the market and kind of revolutionized everything all over again. So if you look at like the last 20 years of mainstream internet, you kind of see, this rapid, advance, from, a time we had to go around and talk to people to a time now where you can literally get by without talking to anyone kind of ever, you know what I mean? And you look, there's these like interesting spikes as well. You have the surge in web adoption in 1995. You have the dot-com boom kind of towards the end of the 90s. Web 2.0, 2003, 2004. The iPhone, 2007. The HTML5 and CSS3 spec that dropped, I think it was 2011 or something like that. And you have today. And it's like these every kind of 4 to 6 years, you have these like major jumps. And there's things like HTML5, CSS3, like if you ask my mom, she's not gonna know what that means, but when responsive design became a thing, it completely like disrupted how, well, I at least did my job. Like you have to come up with whole new processes and figure out a totally new way of doing things. And so the way I kind of like to compare this to is like in the early days, of the web, just doing something interesting with the medium was cool, right? Like you could get by with like, oh, we made a circular navigation, like that's the coolest thing ever, or I could sell a book on the internet was like amazing. Like if you think about even, there's the concept of a hyperlink or being able to dial up and get online and look at a video, like that was like revolutionary. But then you have like, the medium itself was a novelty. But now you like look at where we are today, and the wave that we're riding has gotten really, 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 really big. Basically, it's for every project that comes across my desk these days, I'm designing for multiple markets and cultures. We're managing consistency across platforms, and it's not just desktop, tablet, mobile, and the expected stuff. That's table stakes at this point. Now it's like set-top boxes and consoles and kiosks and wearables, and the list expands every single day. And then like we're always asked for like the second screen experience or a participatory experience, and even like the big screen, little screen. Like what happens when someone pulls out their phone when they're watching television? That's not even good enough anymore. Now it's like what happens when somebody walks into a store? How do they connect with the associate who's there, and how do like you kind of like create that kind of personal touch? And data as well comes from everywhere now. It's not just your interactions of clicking around stuff or your browsing history, but like, I have a phone in my pocket that monitors my physical state. It's the first thing I pick up in the morning, the last thing I put down before I go to sleep. And everything is, the environment around us is constantly being analyzed. And if you look at like all the mediums that have been disintermediated already with digital, you look at movies, television, audio, travel. It's like, it's real easy to be a travel agent with the internet. But what we're seeing now is like these big pushes into the industries that are very, very hard to disrupt and are fraught with red tape. You look at finance, insurance, healthcare, education, automotive, like big revolutions are happening. And in every single one of those cases, there's some startup in Silicon Valley like looking to just destroy everything that has already existed in the past. Which brings me to designing for the future. This is the scariest fucking picture I've ever seen in my entire life. Baby with an iPad. I think like the thing that kind of astounds me at this point is that like I do a lot of recruiting and a lot of interviewing in my job, and I'm starting like as of like a couple years ago, every single kid that comes in to the office that's like entry level, has just come out of college, every single one of those kids has existed in a world where the internet was around from the minute they were born. That's mind-blowing if you think about it. You know what I mean? It's like if you go to the Genius Bar at an Apple store, you do not see young people there. It's only like old people trying to figure out like how things have happened. If you think about these kids, like this kid here, in 20 years, like the idea of like interaction design and like figuring out like interaction patterns, that stuff's just going to be intuitive. It's going to be a given. It's like electricity to us now. No one has to explain to you how to plug a cord into the wall or what that does. But if you like watch Downton Abbey and they're like trying to see if the vapors are leaking out of the wall. Like that's us right now with digital, basically. So like I don't like to make predictions about the future, but like if you look like the MIT New Media Lab, the things that are going to happen in the future are bananas.
Botanics Interactive is a new interactive plant technology. It requires no plant instrumentation. A simple electrode placed in the soil turns any plant into an expressive, multi-touch, gesture-sensitive controller. Touch gestures could be as simple as sliding one finger along the center of a plant. These gestures can be mapped to precise analog control of sounds and music. Proximity and amount of touch can also be recognized.
You heard it here first. Plant UI. Start thinking about it. I'm sure that Google will incorporate this into material design in their next iteration. So this kind of brings me to the next bit of like I kind of have 3 themes in here that I want to talk about for designing for the future, and I'll try not to bore you with them. These kind of get a little bit more complicated as they go on. So the first one's kind of simple, but it's this idea of understanding and kind of that whole thing of like traversing the kind of horizontal landscape of different disciplines and capabilities that you see in the world. And I'll approach this from a interaction design development kind of standpoint. So the first thing that I realized early on is interaction design or information architecture is everywhere. And if you ask like an information architect or a UX designer, whatever title you want, like what tools they use, we have all these tools that exist, card sorts and all that kind of good stuff of like how you kind of figure out how information architecture is supposed to come together. And we think of this, at least I do or did, as like a relatively new thing. But like, what's interesting is like, a couple years ago there was this like big, to-do about like the brand standards, whatever this is, the brand standards for the New York subway system that Massimo Vignelli did in like 1968 or something like that. And it was like, yeah, triumph of design, that's cool. Helvetic is awesome. Swiss design, blah blah blah. But like when I started looking through the screens like of this book. Like right in the very beginning, this thing struck me as very, very interesting. And it's like, oh, this looks familiar. This is progressive disclosure. This is like a thing that I deal with every single day, and it's like a thing we think of as information architecture, interaction design. But Massimo Vignelli, who's a graphic designer who like never even touched the internet, in terms of design, like he was doing this like intuitively in the 60s. And the way that like it's kind of hard to see on the screen, but like basically at the front you just have like all trains, like what the numbers are, and then as you get further into the system, it reveals a little bit more context and a little bit more detail until you reach the destination that you're looking for. On the very next page then, he explains the interaction model, which I think is another thing that's really, really awesome. It's basically information architecture and interaction design for a physical space, and standardizing this so that it can be applied to any station in a very, very complicated network. This is how signage should be placed so that it's usable. Here's how information should be displayed and disseminated so that it's usable. And then even right down to the typography choices that were made. It was all about improving the user experience and improving the interaction of walking through the physical space. It also just happened to be a very elegant design as well. Which kind of brings me to this thing, which is graphic design is interaction design. This is like my favorite book about graphic design, I think, at this point. It's pretty 101, but if you haven't read it, you should. You can actually download the PDF off the internet. I highly recommend that you do. It's a great book. It explains how to do create rational pages and make attractive designs. But if you read the text in it, like the actual copy that's in the book, the entire thing is about interaction design. It's about user experience, about why you want to use grids and typography in certain ways so that it improves cognition and information retention, speed of reading, and all that kind of stuff. It's about the undercurrent of the whole book is about making the interaction or the experience of reading a block of copy more pleasurable, more enjoyable, and more useful. Another one of my favorite examples of this is the I Heart New York logo. And I heard Milton Glaser explain like why this was so has been so effective and has lasted so long, and I think he does a great job of it. This was originally just supposed to be a campaign to promote New York State, actually, in the 70s, and it's just basically kind of stuck around forever because it kind of just people kind of fell in love with it. And his explanation is great of why this works. A decoding has to occur. There's a complete word I. There's a symbol for an emotion, which is the heart, and there are initials for a place. These require 3 little mental adjustments in order to understand the message, but they're so easy to achieve that there is very little possibility that someone won't be able to figure it out. And like, I think this is amazing. He's designed an interaction that's completely static and happens 100% like in your head, but like it's still this kind of little moment of delight that is more useful, more compelling, and more successful than if it just like written the words out and tried to make them look nice. You know what I mean? If you gave the brief of like we need a campaign for loving New York, give it to an interaction designer, they're going to give you a very rational and kind of like a 1 + 1 = 2 kind of answer. And then you give it to a graphic designer, and they give you a piece of art that is actually, that connects with people on a human level. Another example of this, I just wanted to find an excuse to put these in here. Color theory. Like color theory is a thing, like you see kids come out of HCI programs, like they don't know anything about color theory or typography, but you can do a lot to create interactions with just choosing colors and putting them together wisely. Like this isn't an animated GIF. This is just I think it's called a Luzari motion, and it's basically this whole thing is like you put certain colors together that are on opposite ends of the spectrum, and they vibrate, and it creates this illusion of motion. This is another one. There are no black dots on this screen. I literally have like 500 of these, and I had to edit heavily to get these ones in, whatever. The last thing I'll talk about here in this understanding section is, you're only as good as the thing that's shipped. And I think like people kind of know this, but like to go back to that the example about print, like when I was in school and I would like meet graphic designers that I really admired. The thing that always really impressed me was they knew everything about the printing process. They knew how to like set up die cuts, how to save money on print jobs by doubling up projects for multiple clients, picking paper sizes correctly, choosing colors wisely, doing single, double, 4-color process or whatever, spot gloss, you name it, packaging design with how to incorporate folds. Like if you like designing something in a vacuum is very easy, but to actually produce a print project, you actually have to know all this stuff about the printing process that has nothing to do with graphic design. And so to use the same slide twice in one presentation, print code is our printing process, in the digital industry. But I'm kind of amazed by how few designers know anything about HTML, CSS, JavaScript, or anything more complicated than that. And it leads to a lot of unfortunate events where designers assume that something is possible and go to a developer, and developers just say no. But like if you're as a designer, if you know at least what's possible, not necessarily how to like wield the sword yourself. If you know what's possible, you can have a much more sophisticated conversation with developers about what solutions can be applied to a problem. And it goes the other way too, with developers like knowing a thing or two about design, so like what makes a successful experience that way. Number 2, empathy. And this is kind of like I'll kind of use a tech tit for tat kind of example here. In 1980, Bill Gates set out the Microsoft mission statement as this: a computer on every desk and in every home. And he did this at a time when, like, in 1980, computers were, this mysterious and very sort of daunting kind of thing for normal people to get into. But he basically made this. He made the mission statement for Microsoft so easy to understand that like consumers get it, employees get it, suppliers get it. It doesn't really matter. And Bill Gates really understood the network effect and how to propagate his product really, really well. To use the same slide twice in the presentation again, brings you Windows 95. Like there's no mistake that 15 years later, Microsoft was like the most dominant tech player in the game, and their operating system had like something like 90% penetration or something like that. It was because they had this empathetic kind of idea of how people interact with technology. The unfortunate thing is that you cut to 2013, and the sense of empathy kind of got lost. This was the mission statement when Steve Ballmer was CEO. A family of devices and services for individuals and businesses that empower people around the globe, at home, at work, and on the go for the activities they value most. Most tortured fucking sentence in the history of man. What's funny is like you could probably recite back to me the Bill Gates quote verbatim off the top of your head, I bet you can't, if you cover your eyes, you can't remember what this is. And, see you later, Steve Ballmer. The funny thing about this is I worked at Microsoft in the early 2000s, and I remember I was sitting in a meeting with some Microsoft exec, kind of 2002-ish, and this was like the brilliant thing that they said. And at the time, I was like in my early 20s, and I was like, I didn't know anything. I knew I didn't know anything, so I was like, this guy might be right, whatever. The future, you'll have a server in your basement and thin clients throughout your home, serving as your TV, your phone, and everything. That's exactly what the world's like today, right, guys? I got a server in my basement, you? Yeah, I mean, I think the reason that Apple has been so successful in the last 15, 20 years is because they have a very empathetic approach to how design is. It's positive futurism. It's like inserting humanity into technology. And like if you look at kind of the idea here, like people always give them credit for like Johnny Ive and industrial design, and yeah, that stuff is beautiful. But the thing that I am most impressed by with Apple products, they got to the point that the Microsoft exec was talking about of connecting your entire home, but it's not this sort of like overarching, like all-encompassing, all-inclusive, like plug a server into your basement kind of solution. Apple has basically a family of products that plug and play together really, really easily. And when you get one, it works really well, and it's a beautifully designed device. When you get another one, they basically pair together, and each makes each other stronger. If you have an iPhone, it's a great product. If you have an iPhone and an iMac, they basically work together instantly. And if you buy an Airport Extreme or an Airport Express, suddenly you can stream music through your whole house, use your phone as a remote control, have your desktop sitting on your desk with connected to a hard drive or the internet. And the whole thing just works. And they got to the Microsoft vision, but with a much more approachable and I would say better solution. But I kind of alluded to this already. The first word that you see when you open an Apple product is design. I think it's actually the biggest triumph of design in my lifetime, basically. Like, literally every single thing you open says, there's a little card, not unlike this. This one came out of a laptop box that I had 6 months or so ago. Designed by Apple in California. You open the iPhone one, it's the exact same thing. I think, everybody's seen the Steve Ballmer video, developers. I think, Apple is the opposite. It's design, which I think is really, really important to that empathetic kind of point. The last thing I'll talk about here is vision. And I talked about this at the beginning of like the compartmentalization of people and the compartmentalization of skill sets. You can do big things with a small team. You hear this a lot, but small teams don't really work at scale, right? You can't do massive global rollouts with 4 dudes. It's very, very hard to do. It's very hard to maintain, and it's very hard to keep the lights on from that. And so I'll talk about another example of a place that I used to work. And there's 2 concepts here. And the first one is, local maxima and tragedy of the commons, which are big, so I'll talk about them each individually. So local maximum. So local maximum is like kind of the natural outcome of A/B testing, right? Like you have a design, say it's like image carousel or something. You can fiddle with it, to the nth degree and test, control versus variant as many times as you want. And you'll get to a certain point. What that never takes into account is what happens if you just did something completely different, like what we kind of call disruption, right? Like instead of just small incremental optimizations, not just what would happen if you jumped to the next thing. You don't become the leader by imitating the leader and improving slightly. You become the leader by leapfrogging them and doing something fundamentally better or fundamentally more interesting. So tragedy of the commons is we're in England. If you go to the south and you see the common field, like the sheep, if you're a sheep herder, you have this field that all sheep herders are allowed to use. And if you're a capitalistic, entrepreneurial, disruptive sheep herder, your incentive, you're not your incentive, but your motivation probably is to have your sheep graze as much as physically possible so that they're more hardy and they breed better and your flock thrives, blah, 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 blah. The problem is if everybody does that, if everybody does the A/B testing, local maxima, you end up with this thing where the field fails, everybody's flocks dies, and everybody goes out of business. And that's the concept of tragedy of the commons. So I'll talk about Amazon. I used to work at Amazon. And a lot of things that, that we think of it as kind of like big concepts that people talk about today are stuff that Amazon's been doing forever. Like they've been doing A/B testing since day one. They nailed big data 15 years ago. They were first in the game with personalization, collaborative filtering, all that kind of stuff, and they've killed it forever. Like all this optimization stuff that we talk about today and are still kind of encouraging our clients or our stakeholders to invest in. Like Amazon's been doing it for years and years and years. And the number one thing that they did, or Jeff Bezos' kind of big insight for how they would get to scale quickly, was this the concept of this small team idea. And Amazon is a great example of what happens when you push small teams to scale. The concept, if you're a developer, you might have heard of this before, but I never had. It's this concept of 2 pizza teams. And so the rule at Amazon was if your team was if your team couldn't be fed with 2 teams because it was there wasn't enough, you had to split the team into smaller teams. So like if the team could be fed with 2 pizzas, that's the right size for a team. It's great in theory, but what's missing is governance, right? Like it's a good way for to give people autonomy and responsibility and ownership and encourage entrepreneurialism. But if you don't have governance, like the whole kind of thing falls apart. And so I went through and just did a little kind of fun experiment. This is a little bit old, but I went through. These are all taken in the same day, just at different parts of the Amazon website, and it's basically product carousels in different places. And for a little kind of peek behind the curtain of how Amazon works, like basically every module on the website is run by an independent team. They do their own thing. They push it out to the web. Like no one owns complete pages. So there's a team that did your recently viewed items. This is probably the personalization team. There's a team that does Kindle Select 25 exciting books. This is like a top 10s team probably. And then this is like the subscribe and save team that does this stuff for like subscription consumables. All different teams, all doing their own thing. And every single one of them has quantitative data that says this is the best solution for what a product carousel should look like. Every single one of them tested it, conversion went up, and then it went live. Statistically significant is what they call that. But I think like there's this guy, Russ Akoff, another person you should look into because I'm like obsessed with him right now. He's done a lot of thinking about systems like this, and this quote kind of sums it up really nicely. If we have a system of improvement that's directed at improving the parts taken separately, you can be absolutely sure that the performance of the whole will not be improved. If you think about like a car, if you take the best parts out of every car in the world and then try to put them all together to have like the best car ever, you're not even going to have a car because the parts don't fit. It's that kind of idea. And he has this awesome concept called the wisdom channel that I think is really brilliant in kind of illustrating kind of how this works. Because I think like the concept here is like creativity is discontinuity, right? And like if you take like I'll kind of walk through this because it's complicated. But at the front you have data. Say that you have like I have a hard drive. It has 400 files on it with 2 terabytes that equal 2 terabytes of data. Okay, great. You put that through a very simple kind of human filter, and then you get information. So, I have a hard drive full of media about cats. There's articles, there's videos, there's pictures, all that kind of stuff. Cool. So I apply theory and past experience, and then it generates knowledge. So you start to you make a website or a multimedia presentation about cats. It's the internet. We're going to be rich. And then after you do that and you put it out there in the world and you play with it and you try different things, that leads to understanding. It's the kind of explanation of why, right? Like, hairless cats aren't so popular. There's a cat in Japan called Maru who has a weird obsession with cardboard boxes. Cougars are older ladies who like to take young men on dates. And when you get to this point, you have this idea of like, the past. It's like knowledge and engineering. It's what's been done. It's that you can tell that you're doing things right. What this doesn't do is tell you like what's the next big thing, right? Like, maybe we should look into dogs. But testing against cats isn't going to tell you that. Or maybe, domesticated animals aren't even a thing anymore. Maybe we should invest in robots. It's like there's this kind of, it's that leapfrog thing, right? There you go. Waiting for the dude to take a picture. But like I think like if you look at this 2 lines before you get to wisdom, it's like what is best? It's like the vision. It's like it's the difference between doing things right and doing the right things is kind of that strategy and design thing, like beyond just simple understanding. And I think like in technology, we think of this intuitively as disruption. It's the thing we're all pushing for. It's like Uber's disrupting all of taxis. There's like basically the entire automotive industry is going to fall apart in the next 5 to 10 years because of self-driving cars and things like Uber and the fact that millennials all want to move to cities and don't want to own a car and all this kind of stuff. You can just see the entire automotive industry eroding. You look at banking and insurance and all these other things. Every single one of them is running up against the same problem. And it's kind of this thing of continuous improvement isn't nearly as important as discontinuous improvement. I already said the whole thing about leapfrogging the leader in front of you. But a creative act it breaks the chain that has come before it, and it's played out in technology every single day. The unfortunate thing about this is, as a person, it's very hard to disrupt yourself, unless you're Paul Weller, I guess. But it's very hard for you to kind of just suddenly become like, oh, the Medici family told me that they were going to kill me, and now I'm a painter. Like, not everybody can do that. Because like in biology, unlike in technology, you have evolution. And it's this whole kind of thing of like slow process of improvement and pushing into one space or another. And the same way that I evolved from a graphic designer doing print work to a digital designer, from a Flash guy to a visual designer to an interaction designer to a front-end developer, sort of, to an information architect, sort of, to a content strategist, sort of, to a user researcher, sort of. It's all about evolution. And I'll kind of leave you with this last quote, Charles Darwin. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And as the digital industry and the design industry and the world changes and evolves over time, I think this is super, super relevant. Not just to maybe we're going to grow gills and it'll be like Waterworld, but evolving your skill set and taking more of that generalist attitude. And maybe we won't all be polymaths, but I think we could all kind of at least strive to be a bit more of a generalist and a bit less of a specialist, because I think the entire world will benefit from it, and so will we. That's it.